you drive 2 hours outside of Shanghai or take a train deep into the interior provinces of Yunnan or Guizhou, you will eventually find them. They are monuments to a civilization that never arrived. Forest after forest of 30-story concrete towers, stretching as far as the eye can see, completely empty. The wind whistles through window frames that have no glass. The roads are paved, the streetlights are installed, but there are no cars. These are the ghost cities. For the last few years, Western media has treated these places as a spectacle, a quirky side effect of China's breakneck speed. But then came the collapse of Evergrande, then Country Garden, then the protests. When the developers defaulted on hundreds of billions of dollars in debt, the cranes stopped moving. Millions of Chinese citizens realized that the apartments they had poured their life savings into would never be built. The concrete skeletons standing in the rain weren't just construction sites. They were tombstones for the world's largest asset class. The narrative you usually hear is one of corporate greed. We are told stories about reckless CEOs buying private jets while their companies drowned in debt. But that is a comfortable lie. It suggests that if you just jail a few executives, the problem goes away. The reality is far more terrifying. This collapse was not an accident, nor was it a result of free market chaos. It was mathematically engineered. It was the inevitable result of a specific policy decision made in Beijing 30 years ago. To understand why the Chinese economy is currently paralyzed by a $3 trillion real estate crisis, you don't need to look at the stock market charts of 2023. You need to look at a tax reform bill signed in 1994. This is the story of how a government, trying to save itself, inadvertently built a doomsday machine. To understand the magnitude of the mistake, we have to go back to the days before the skyscrapers. In the early 1990s, the People's Republic of China was in a precarious position. The country was opening up, the economy was growing, but the central government in Beijing was surprisingly poor. At the time, China operated under a fiscal system that bordered on feudalism. Local governments in the provinces were the ones collecting the taxes, and they were supposed to send a portion of that money up to the central government. But, as has been the case throughout Chinese history, the provinces were powerful and stubborn. They hid revenue. They negotiated. They kept the lion's share of the wealth for themselves. By 1993, the central government's share of total tax revenue had dropped to dangerously low levels. Beijing was politically powerful, but fiscally impotent. They couldn't fund a military modernization, they couldn't balance regional inequality, and they couldn't project power. The leadership was terrified that the country would fracture, breaking apart much like the Soviet Union just had. Enter Zhu Rongji. He was the vice premier, a stern, no-nonsense economic technocrat who earned the nickname One Chop Jew for his willingness to chop heads and chop bureaucracy. He realized that for the Communist Party to survive, Beijing needed the money. He launched a crusade to overhaul the tax code. In 1994, he implemented the tax-sharing reform system. It was a masterstroke of centralization. The reform completely rewired the plumbing of the Chinese economy. It took the most lucrative taxes, like the value-added tax and corporate taxes, and routed them directly to Beijing. Almost overnight, the central government's share of revenue skyrocketed. The crisis of authority was solved. Beijing had the cash. But in economics, there are no solutions, only trade-offs. And Zhu Rongji had made a fatal trade-off. While he centralized the revenue, he did not centralize the responsibilities. Local governments were still required to pay for almost everything. They had to fund the schools, the hospitals, the trash collection, the police, and the road maintenance. Imagine you are the mayor of a medium-sized Chinese city in 1995. You wake up one morning and realize your budget has been slashed by 50% because Beijing took all your tax revenue. But you still have to pay the teachers and pave the roads. If you fail, the people will riot and you will be fired. You look at your ledger, you have massive expenses and almost no income. You are desperate. But Zhu Rongji had left you a loophole, a small, seemingly insignificant concession. The 1994 reform allowed local governments to keep the revenue generated from land, specifically the land transfer fees. In China, you cannot buy land permanently, but you can buy the rights to use it for 70 years. This loophole became the oxygen for the entire political system. It created a mechanism known as land finance. For a local official, the incentives suddenly aligned in a dangerous direction. If you wanted to build a subway system or a new park, you didn't look to tax revenue. You looked to the dirt under your feet. You would rezone a patch of farmland on the edge of the city, evict the farmers with minimal compensation, and sell the development rights to a real estate company for a massive markup. The developer would pay you millions in cash. You would use that cash to build infrastructure. The new infrastructure made the surrounding land more valuable, so you would rezone the next patch of farmland, sell it for even more money, and build even more infrastructure. It was a perfect, self-reinforcing loop. The more you built, the more the land was worth. The more the land was worth, the more you could borrow to build. For 20 years, this looked like an economic miracle. It turned muddy fishing villages into metropolises like Shenzhen. It consumed more concrete in 3 years than the United States used in the entire 20th century. But beneath the gleaming skyline, a cancer was growing. The system turned local governments into land speculators. They weren't governing anymore, they were running a hedge fund. They became addicted to high land prices. If land prices dropped, the city went bankrupt. Therefore, the government had to ensure that real estate prices only went up. They restricted supply, they encouraged speculation, and they tied the entire nation's GDP growth to the construction of apartments. This brings us to the developers, the Evergrandes of the world. They were the other half of this fatal equation. Since the local governments needed to sell land at high prices to survive, developers needed massive amounts of capital to buy it. They borrowed billions. And to pay back those loans, they developed a model that resembled a Ponzi scheme more than a business. They started selling apartments before they were built. This is common in many places, but in China, the buyer pays the full amount up front, often years in advance. The developer takes that cash, your life savings, and instead of using it to finish your apartment, they use it to buy more land from the local government to start the next project. The money from Project B pays for Project A. The money from Project C pays for Project B. As long as prices kept rising and people kept buying, the music kept playing. Everyone was happy. The local government got their revenue, the developer got their billionaire status, and the regular citizen got an asset that doubled in value every few years. This is where the psychology of the Chinese people enters the tragedy. You have to understand that in China, the stock market is viewed as a casino, corrupt and volatile. Capital controls prevent you from moving your money out of the country. So where do you put your savings? You buy an apartment, then you buy another one for your son, then one for your parents. Housing became the only trusted bank account. It wasn't about shelter, it was about storing wealth. In the US, real estate accounts for a significant chunk of household wealth, but in China, it reached nearly 70%. The entire net worth of the middle class was trapped in concrete boxes in the sky. The fatal mistake of 1994 had mutated. It wasn't just a tax policy anymore, it was the social contract. The legitimacy of the Communist Party relied on the promise that tomorrow would be richer than today, and that richness was measured in square footage. But exponential growth runs into a hard wall, reality. By 2020, the cracks were undeniable. The ghost cities were no longer just in the remote provinces. They were creeping toward the Tier 1 cities. There were an estimated 65 million empty apartments in China. That is enough housing to accommodate the entire population of France, sitting empty, gathering dust. The demand was drying up because the demographics were shifting. The population was shrinking. The massive wave of urbanization was slowing down. You essentially ran out of people to sell to. This is when the central government, now under Xi Jinping, realized the danger. They saw a housing bubble of historic proportions, one that dwarfed the US subprime bubble of 2008. They decided to gently deflate it. They introduced the 3 red lines, a policy designed to limit how much debt developers could take on. They thought they could engineer a soft landing. They were wrong. When they cut off the credit, the Ponzi scheme stopped instantly. Remember, the developers were using new money to finish old projects. When the money stopped, the construction stopped. Suddenly, you had millions of people paying mortgages on homes that were just holes in the ground. The developers defaulted. The suppliers, the cement companies, the painters, the steel mills, stopped getting paid. And the local governments? The land sales, their primary source of income, evaporated. This brings us to the present stagnation. This is not a standard recession. This is a balance sheet recession, similar to what happened to Japan in the 1990s, but on a scale that is hard to comprehend. The local governments are sitting on hidden debt estimated to be anywhere between $7 and $11 trillion. They cannot stimulate the economy because they are technically insolvent. They are cutting bus routes, slashing civil servant salaries, and in some cases, fining restaurants for absurd violations just to scrape together cash. The central government is paralyzed. If they bail out the real estate market, they reinflate the bubble and encourage the same reckless behavior that caused the mess. If they let it crash, they wipe out the savings of the middle class, destroying the social stability that keeps them in power. The 1994 tax-sharing reform achieved its goal. It made Beijing powerful. It prevented the country from fracturing. It funded the military expansion and the Belt and Road Initiative. But the cost was the creation of an economy that cannibalized itself. By stripping the provinces of sustainable revenue, Beijing forced them to feast on the future. We are watching the unwinding of 30 years of artificial growth. The shiny skyscrapers and the high-speed trains are real, but the financing behind them was a hallucination. The geopolitical implications are profound. A China that is consumed by a domestic debt crisis is a different animal than the juggernaut we feared 5 years ago. Economic stagnation breeds nationalism. When a government can no longer promise prosperity, it often turns to external conflicts to maintain legitimacy. The ghost cities are not just an economic failure, they are a geopolitical risk factor. This story reveals the fragility of top-down systems. The architect, Zhu Rongji was brilliant. The policy was logical. But no planner, no matter how intelligent, can foresee how a single incentive will mutate over 3 decades. He wanted to secure tax revenue. Instead, he turned the soil of his nation into a casino chip. Now, the wheel has stopped spinning, the dealer is calling for the money, and the players are looking at a hand that holds nothing but dust. The lesson is brutal and simple. You can print money, you can rezone land, and you can pour concrete, but you cannot legislate value. Eventually, the market clears. And when the market clears on a mistake this large, it doesn't just bankrupt companies, it breaks nations.